Everyone feared the hospital CEO until the new nurse arrived and did the impossible. But this is not just a story about one man hitting the floor. It is about what happens when fear becomes policy, when good people go silent to keep their jobs, and when one calm voice steps into a room where everyone else has already learned to look away. Picture it, fluorescent lights buzzing over an emergency department rain against the ambulance bay doors. Monitors pulsing, nurses moving fast with their heads down because the wrong glance, the wrong word can cost everything. Then a frightened patient starts to tremble. A powerful man starts to shout, and one quiet nurse decides that tonight no one gets hurt on her watch. Stay with me, because this story cuts deeper than revenge. And before we begin, like the video and comment where you're watching from. To understand why that moment split the whole hospital open, you have to see what Harbor Point Medical Center had become long before Nora Bennett ever walked through its doors. Harbor Point stood over the Elizabeth River in Norfolk like a promise made in glass and steel. From the street, it looked clean, modern, expensive. The kind of hospital donors loved to photograph. The kind of building families pointed to from the parking garage and called a blessing because it seemed too bright, too polished to hold anything ugly inside it. But buildings learn the character of the people who rule them. Inside Harbor Point, the lights were always a little too cold. The air smelled of bleach coffee and fatigue. Elevators opened onto hallways where shoes moved quickly and voices stayed low. Nurses smiled for patients, then let the smiles fall the second they stepped back into the corridor. Residents checked their phones too often, not for messages but for the time, counting down the minutes until the end of shift like prisoners marking a wall. Even laughter had become careful. It happened in short bursts followed by silence, as if joy itself could get written up. The hospital still saved lives. It still stabilized heart attacks, treated infections, delivered babies, cooled fevers, and brought oxygen back into lungs that had forgotten how to pull it in. People still came through those doors desperate, and left with one more day, one more week, sometimes one more decade. That part was real. So was the fear. Victor Lang had been Chief Executive Officer of Harbor Point for 5 years, and the board loved to say he brought discipline to the system. Before, Victor margins had slipped, units had overspent, department heads had argued over staffing and supply budgets. After Victor, the quarterly reports looked cleaner. Waste was down. Labor costs were cut. Vendor contracts were renegotiated. The board received polished presentations with neat graphs and confident language. He stood at the head of those presentations in tailored suits and spoke in a voice that never shook. He used phrases like operational efficiency, strategic alignment, measurable performance. Men who sat on boards and golfed with other men who sat on boards heard those phrases and nodded with approval. Donors shook his hand. Local magazines put him on covers. He looked like control. The people under him knew the difference between control and cruelty. At first, it had been small enough to explain away. A raised voice in a meeting, a humiliating correction in front of staff, the kind of sharp public embarrassment that leaves a room silent because nobody wants to be the next one under the blade. Then came the impossible deadlines, the schedule changes designed to punish rather than solve the habit of calling people into offices just to watch them come apart. Victor did not scream all the time. That would have been easier to understand. He preferred precision. He preferred to know exactly where a person's dignity lived and press his thumb there until it bruised. A nurse named Alicia Gomez once corrected a medication stocking error during a committee review because the wrong concentration had been logged for a pediatric unit. She did it politely. She even apologized for interrupting. Victor stared at her long enough to make everyone else stop breathing, then asked if she believed it was appropriate to challenge leadership in front of finance personnel. Alicia tried to explain that the issue was clinical safety, not authority. By the end of the week, her schedule had been cut, her annual evaluation downgraded, and her transfer request mysteriously denied. She resigned within 2 months. A respiratory therapist named Ben Rollins was written up 3 times in 1 quarter for what administrators called attitude. His actual offense was disagreeing with a staffing reduction during a run of severe pneumonia cases. He pointed out in an email that was calm and evidence-based that delayed respiratory response times would put patients at risk. Victor printed that email, circled the phrase "patient at risk" with a red pen, and held it up during a management meeting. People who use fear to manipulate policy, Victor said, have no place in this institution. Ben was gone by spring. Then there had been the first slap. People still talked about it in pieces and unfinished sentences and looks exchanged by the medication room door. The young nurse who received it had walked in on a donor meeting without realizing the door had not been locked. She had entered holding lab results, cheeks pink with embarrassment, already apologizing. Victor stepped into the hall after her. A donor later said he heard a sound like a chart binder hitting tile. What actually echoed down that corridor was palm against skin. No one stopped him. The nurse filed a complaint. Human Resources conducted interviews. The donor witnesses became uncertain. Victor described the nurse as unstable and disruptive. The complaint disappeared into process. The nurse left healthcare less than 6 months later. After that, the hospital changed in a way that had nothing to do with policy manuals. People learned which doors not to knock on, which meetings to speak carefully in, which tone of Victor's voice meant danger, and which meant only displeasure. Some leaders create culture with mission statements. Victor created it with memory. He made sure everyone remembered what happened to people who challenged him. The slaps did not happen often enough to predict, but often enough to haunt. The threat of them became part of the architecture. It lived in the narrow space between an elevator ding and the first sight of Victor turning the corner. It lived in the way nurses automatically lowered their eyes when his leather soles clicked toward them. It lived in the sudden stiffness of a unit secretary's shoulders when his name appeared on caller ID. Human Resources knew. Of course, they knew. Security knew. Several directors knew. The board knew enough to ask careful questions and accept polished answers. That is how institutions protect themselves when they are not ready to choose between money and conscience. They build a language soft enough to hide behind. Concern becomes complexity. Violence becomes a personnel matter. Fear becomes morale. And the person at the center of it all becomes too expensive to confront. By the time the position opened on the 4th floor medical surgical unit in late summer, Harbor Point had burned through 14 nurses in a year. Some lasted 3 months. Some lasted 6 weeks. One lasted 9 days. The recruiter had started to lie by omission because the truth was bad for hiring. A demanding culture became a fast-paced environment. Leadership volatility became high standards. Chronic understaffing became an opportunity for growth. Then Nora Bennett submitted her application. On paper, she looked almost too good to be available. 10 years of nursing experience, critical care certification, strong references from a regional hospital outside Richmond. Clean license, no disciplinary notes, flexible schedule, immediate start. Her interview was brief and almost oddly smooth. She answered questions, clearly never oversold herself, and asked the kind of practical things seasoned nurses ask when they have worked enough floors to know the difference between brochure language and real life. What was the average nurse-patient ratio on nights? How were rapid response calls coordinated between units? Was there a dedicated float pool, or did staffing move shift by shift? She did not ask why the position had been vacant for months. She did not ask why turnover had become so severe. The recruiter noted that as a blessing. Nora arrived on a Monday morning in early September, carrying a plain canvas duffel over one shoulder. Norfolk was still humid from the tail end of summer. The hospital entrance doors breathed cool air over her as they opened. She paused for half a second inside the lobby, taking in the polished floor. The bright volunteer desk, the security station, the overhead directory board with its cheerful arrows and calm blue lettering. Families moved around her carrying overnight bags and paper coffee cups. Somewhere in the distance, a child cried. Somewhere else, a transport chair rolled across tile with a faint rattle in one wheel. The security guard asked for her ID. She handed it over and smiled. First day. "Welcome to Harbor Point," he said. There was something tired in the way he said it, like a man repeating a line he no longer expected anyone to believe. Nora noticed that. She noticed everything. She thanked him, clipped on her temporary badge, and crossed the lobby at an easy pace that looked unremarkable unless you knew what alertness looked like in motion. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her eyes were not. She clocked the exits without appearing to. She glanced once at the camera above the information desk. She registered the flow of people, the location of the nearest stairwell, the way two nurses in navy scrubs stopped speaking when an administrator in a charcoal suit passed by. Orientation was held in a beige conference room that smelled faintly of toner and dry marker. A human resources coordinator named Melissa passed out packets and spoke in a voice so practiced it seemed detached from any actual human feeling. Hospital values, attendance policy, documentation standards, incident reporting, safe lifting procedures, infection control. The language of institutions rolled on for an hour, flattening everything it touched. Nora took notes in neat block print. She listened. She asked about stroke protocols and telemetry escalation routes. She thanked Melissa when the woman handed her a benefits folder. Most people in the room were too distracted by first-day nerves to notice the details. Nora was not. She noticed Melissa's hesitation when discussing workplace concerns. She noticed that the phrase open-door communication came paired with a quick movement of the eyes toward the conference room door, as if those words themselves needed checking. She noticed the little silence that landed over the room when someone asked whether executives still conducted random floor rounds. "Oh yes," Melissa said. "Senior leadership is very present." No one asked anything after that. By late morning, Nora was on 4 South with Dana Keller, the charge nurse who had stopped believing promises years ago, but still believed in patient care strongly enough to keep coming back. Dana was in her 40s, compact, sharp-eyed, with the posture of someone carrying invisible weight. There was no softness left in her movements. Every step looked efficient because wasted energy had long ago become a luxury. "This is the med room. Pyxis codes update every 90 days. Don't trust the printer in the charting alcove. It jams when you actually need it. Linen room there. Wound supplies in the back cabinet because people kept stealing them for other units. If a family member says they have not seen a doctor in 6 hours, they're probably right." Nora smiled lightly. Good to know. Dana kept walking. "Telemetry overflow comes up here when 6 West fills. We try not to float brand new staff on day 1. Try." Dana glanced at her. "You learn fast." The unit was full. Full in the way hospitals often are, where no one uses the word full, because there are still stretchers in hallways and chairs in corners, and somehow there is always space for one more body if that body needs enough help. Call lights blinked. An IV pump chimed from somewhere behind a curtain. A television muttered game show applause in one room, while a patient coughed a wet cough in another. The air held the layered sound of medicine trying to outrun time. Nora stepped into it like she had always been there. She introduced herself to patients without hurry. "Hi, I'm Nora, one of the nurses on the floor today." She adjusted blankets, checked IV sites, listened longer than necessary when an old man wanted to describe his shortness of breath in his own words instead of the charts. She did not perform warmth. She offered it. Patients sensed the difference. Around noon, Dana found her standing at a bedside explaining a blood thinner to a worried daughter in language simple enough to calm but not simplify. "So, the medication is helping stop the clot from growing," Nora said. "That means we watch for bleeding, bruising, and any sudden change. You don't have to memorize everything right now. I'll go over it again before I leave." The daughter exhaled for what looked like the first time in minutes. "Thank you." After they stepped out, Dana handed Nora a fresh set of vitals to chart. "You do that well." The explaining part, the making people feel less alone part. Nora looked down the hall toward a room where a bed alarm had just started beeping. That's usually the part they remember. Word about Victor reached her before lunch. It came in fragments first, the way dangerous truths do in places built to contain them. A unit secretary named Marisol leaned over the front desk while printing armbands and said without looking up, "If you hear people go quiet all at once, check whether he's on the floor." "Who?" Marisol stopped the printer with 2 fingers. "The man whose name nobody says unless they need to." Later in the break room, a nurse, still young enough to be frightened in visible ways, stood by the vending machine and spoke so softly Nora almost did not catch it. "Just don't be alone with him." "With who?" The nurse stared as if Nora had asked the weather to define itself. "Victor Lang." Dana walked in at that moment, carrying a chart. The younger nurse shut up immediately and left the room without getting the drink she had paid for. Dana set the chart down. "They've already started warning you." Nora leaned against the counter. "Should I listen?" Dana gave a dry laugh that lasted less than a second. "Depends how attached you are to peace." She opened the chart, then closed it again. Something in Nora's stillness had made pretended ignorance feel pointless. "Victor does rounds like he's inspecting troops," Dana said. "He likes order. He likes obedience. He likes being reminded that everyone knows who signs the checks." Nora watched her quietly. Dana lowered her voice. "If he speaks to you, answer once and keep it short. Don't correct him in public. Don't challenge him. If he's already angry, get out of the line of fire." "The line of fire," Nora repeated. Dana heard the phrase after saying it and shook her head. "Forget that." But Nora did not forget it. Her expression changed so slightly most people would have missed it. "All right," she said. That answer unsettled Dana more than questions would have. By the end of the shift, Harbor Point had formed its first impression of Nora Bennett. She was capable, gentle with patience, organized under pressure, not loud, not showy. A nurse who charted on time, washed her hands without being reminded, and brought the blanket warmer into a room before an elderly patient had to ask. She looked, in other words, like someone Harbor Point would either cherish or break. No one yet understood there was a third possibility. On her second day, a post-operative patient in room 412 began drifting toward sepsis. The early signs were easy to miss if you only read the numbers and not the body attached to them. Temperature slightly up, pressure slightly soft, skin not yet pale enough to alarm. The patient kept saying he felt cold. A resident dismissed it as normal post-surgical discomfort. Nora looked at the patient once, then again. "His mentation is off," she said. The resident barely glanced up from the computer. "He's tired. He's changing," Nora said. There was no challenge in her tone, only certainty. The resident came to the bedside more out of irritation than trust. 15 minutes later, blood cultures were ordered, antibiotics started, rapid response placed on standby. The resident did not apologize, but he stayed closer to room 412 for the next hour. By evening, 3 different nurses had noticed the same thing about Nora. She saw trouble early. She moved quickly when she had to, and when pressure rose, she seemed to grow calmer. That night, while restocking a supply cart outside room 419, an orderly dropped a metal tray at the far end of the hall. The crash rang hard off the tile. 3 nurses jumped. Nora turned, only turned. No flinch, no startled breath, just an instant clean assessment of the source and distance of the sound. Then she went back to the cart. Marisol, who had seen more than enough people startled by less, stared openly. "You didn't jump." Nora fitted a box of syringes into place. "Should I have?" "Most of us do." Nora shut the cart drawer with her hip. "Most of you are tired." That was true, but it was not the whole truth, and Marisol knew it. On day 3, an elderly patient named Frank Delaney was admitted with pneumonia dehydration and the stubborn refusal to let anyone help him to the bathroom. He had marine tattoos blurred by age and a voice roughened by decades of cigarettes and Atlantic wind. Old soldiers have a way of identifying each other even when the uniform is long gone, and Frank watched Nora with a narrowing, thoughtful gaze every time she entered the room. She adjusted his nasal cannula, checked his lungs, then reached for the blood pressure cuff. Frank caught her sleeve with weak fingers. "You military—" Her hand paused on the Velcro. "No," she said after a beat. Frank's weathered mouth bent with something like humor. "That answer's got room in it." Nora secured the cuff. "You were Marine Corps. Long time ago." He studied her as the machine cycled. "People who never had to scan rooftops don't usually stand where you stand." Nora glanced toward the room door. She had placed herself where she could see both hallway and patient at once, without seeming to do either. When she looked back, Frank's eyes were still on her. "You should rest, Mr. Delaney." He nodded, as if that too told him what he needed to know. Later, Dana asked how the old veteran liked his new nurse. "He said I stand funny," Nora replied. Dana snorted despite herself. "You do." Nora turned from the sink, drying her hands. "How so?" "Like you're balanced for something." The answer came with the barest trace of a smile. "Maybe I've had enough coffee." Dana wanted to laugh. Instead, she found herself watching Nora more closely. Victor finally saw her on Thursday morning. He came off the elevator with an administrator at his shoulder, and tension moving ahead of him like weather. The administrator was mid-sentence carrying a tablet and talking about vendor pricing. Victor was not listening. He never really listened when he was on the floor. He scanned, judged, collected imperfections. A housekeeping cart too close to the nurse's station. A physician coat hung on the back of a chair. A family member asleep with shoes off on a visitor couch. Victor noticed everything because power to him was the right to decide what details mattered. Nora was outside room 417 reviewing a chart. Every person within sight felt him arrive and subtly changed shape. Aides straightened. One nurse looked down at her med list so fast she nearly dropped it. Dana felt her neck go rigid. Nora looked up. For one brief second, the hallway held a silence so complete, the buzz of fluorescent lighting seemed loud. "Good morning," Nora said. Calm, professional, no tremor. Victor stopped. He was used to being feared on sight. He mistook that fear for respect because it made his world simpler. Nora gave him neither fear nor challenge, only acknowledgement. It unsettled him more than open dislike would have. New hire the administrator supplied quickly, as if labeling her might contain the moment. Victor's eyes stayed on Nora a fraction too long. "Do you like it here so far?" The question sounded polite. It was not. Nora closed the chart. "I'm still learning the unit." Victor smiled without warmth. "You'll find we value discipline." Nora nodded once. "That's usually easier in places where people trust each other." The administrator's face lost color. Dana actually stopped breathing. Victor's expression did not change. That made it worse. "Trust," he said softly, "is earned." "Yes," Nora replied, "it is." Then a patient called from room 417, and she turned away to answer, leaving Victor standing in the corridor with his smile thinning at the edges. He kept walking, but not before Dana saw the look in his eyes. Interest. Irritation. Recognition of resistance before proof of it. At lunch, Dana found Nora in the break room opening a yogurt with clinical precision. "What was that?" Nora looked up. "Lunch. Do not do that with him." Nora set the spoon down. "What?" "Stand there like he's just another man." For the first time since arriving, something older and harder came through her voice. "He is." Dana stared at her. Around them, the break room hummed with vending machines and a muted daytime talk show. Beyond the door, a code was called overhead. The whole hospital kept moving, but for Dana, the room had narrowed to the woman sitting across from her in blue scrubs, calm hands, steady eyes, and a stillness that looked less like innocence by the minute. "You don't understand this place yet," Dana said. Nora picked up the spoon again. Maybe not. It was not agreement, it was mercy. That evening, the floor ran behind. A family wanted updates. Pharmacy delayed an antibiotic. A patient with dementia tried twice to leave the unit. Dana snapped at an intern, then apologized. By 7:30, everyone felt wrung thin. Nora, finished charting, closed the computer and stepped into the hall just as a stretcher rolled past with a trauma transfer from the emergency department. Blood on the sheet. Pressure bag hanging. A resident jogging beside it. The familiar speed of organized crisis. Nora moved to the wall to clear space. The team passed. The wheel rattle faded. A transport monitor beeped around the corner. Somewhere down another corridor, a man's voice rose, sharp and angry enough to make two nurses instinctively stiffen. Victor again. Nora did not look alarmed. She looked attentive. Dana saw it. Not fear, not even dread. Something like measurement. The sound cut off as suddenly as it had started. The unit exhaled. Someone muttered, "Jesus." Marisol rubbed the bridge of her nose. An aide laughed weakly at nothing. The little rituals of recovery after tension rolled through the station. Nora stood very still for a moment, listening to the silence left behind. Then she went back to work. By the end of that week, Harbor Point had begun to notice that the new nurse was not becoming smaller to fit the place. She was moving through it with the composed, watchful ease of someone who had entered difficult rooms before and learned long ago that fear was only useful if you let it sharpen you. Dana felt it before she understood it. So did Marisol. So did old Frank Delaney every time Nora checked his lungs and scanned the hallway without seeming to. Even Victor, though he would never have admitted it, had started to feel that slight drag of attention toward her whenever she was near, as if some buried instinct in him recognized a person who did not bend the way the others bent. On Friday, the hospital was already stretched thin by noon. Beds were full. The emergency department had begun calling up for space. Staffing was short on the night board. Rain moved in from the coast, tapping first at windows, then pressing harder. Dana stood at the nurse's station studying the assignments with one hand on her hip and exhaustion behind her eyes. "We're floating one to the ER at 6, she said. Marisol made a face. Lucky them. Dana looked up from the board toward Nora, who was at the hand-washing sink scrubbing in after dressing a wound. "Nora," Dana said, "you've got the cleanest charting and the steadiest pulse. You're going downstairs tonight." Nora dried her hands and reached for a fresh pair of gloves. "All right," she said, and in the sudden metallic crash of a dropped tray somewhere beyond the station, while every other head jerked toward the sound, Nora Bennett simply turned and listened. She turned and listened, and that was the first thing Dana noticed. Not surprise, not nerves, listening. Like the dropped tray was not an interruption, but information. The sound faded. The hallway settled. Marisol bent to pick up the fallen instruments with a muttered curse, and one of the younger nurses laughed too brightly to cover how rattled she felt. The ordinary little tremors of a hospital shift moved on. Alarms went off. A call light blinked. Someone in room 421 wanted ice chips, and someone else wanted pain medication that had already been given 10 minutes earlier. Life on the unit closed over the moment as if nothing had happened. But Dana kept watching Nora. "You ever work emergency?" she asked. Nora peeled off her gloves and dropped them in the bin. "Some. That usually means yes. It means enough." Dana should have found that annoying. Instead, she felt the same strange sensation she had felt all week around this woman. The sense that every answer had more underneath it than it showed on the surface. By 6:00, the rain had turned steady and cold against the windows. Harbor Point took on that particular evening look hospitals get when daylight pulls away and fluorescent light becomes the only sky people have left. The floors looked whiter. Faces looked more tired. Coffee tasted worse. The shift change rush came and went in a blur of badge swipes, rushed updates, fresh scrubs, and the smell of damp jackets from people hurrying in through the storm. Dana handed Nora the float sheet at the nurse's station. ER is short 2 nurses and 1 tech. They're boarding patients because upstairs is backed up. Dr. Park is down there tonight. He's good. Nora glanced at the sheet. Any problem, patients? Dana almost smiled. In emergency, all of them. Then the smile vanished. Victor has been circling all afternoon. Nora folded the float sheet once and slid it into her pocket. You say that like weather. It is weather. Nora met her eyes. Weather changes. Dana looked away first. The elevator ride down was packed with transport staff, a respiratory therapist carrying tubing, and a family member in a church dress crying quietly into a wet paper towel. No one talked. The elevator chimed at each stop with the soft, polite sound of a machine pretending nothing inside it hurt. Nora stood in the back corner with one hand hooked through the strap of her canvas bag. She felt the rhythm of the building through the floor under her shoes. Stretchers moving, doors opening, the coded pulse of announcements overhead. Somewhere on another level, a crash cart was being pushed fast enough that one wheel rattled out of sync. Hospitals speak in machinery and footfalls before they speak in words. You learn to hear the strain. When the doors opened on emergency, the strain hit all at once. The ER was a river in flood. Phones ringing, monitors pulsing, a toddler crying with the raw, endless grief only toddlers can sustain. Two paramedics wheeling in a man with a soaked shirt pressed against a bleeding scalp. A resident trying to call radiology over the noise. A security officer near triage talking low and firm to a handcuffed patient who kept insisting he had not done anything wrong. The air smelled like saline-wet pavement antiseptic and the burnt edge of coffee that had sat too long on a warmer. Nora took one step into it and felt the place organize itself in her mind. 2 hall beds occupied. 3 boarders still waiting on inpatient beds. 1 trauma room half reset. 1 attending moving too fast because the staffing board had already failed him. Dr. Ethan Park looked up from a charting station and saw her badge. Please tell me you can start an IV in the dark. Nora crossed to him. Depends how dark. He gave a tired laugh through his nose. Good enough. I'm Ethan. Nora. He handed her a folded patient list, already marked in blue ink. I've got chest pain in 7, abdominal pain in 10, psych hold in hall 3, and an elderly fall in 12. Triage keeps stacking because urgent care closed early. Who's charge? For the moment, God. Nora scanned the room again. So no one. You learn fast, too. She tucked the patient list under the keyboard. Any unit politics I need to know before I step on a landmine. Ethan looked at her for one beat too long. He had the face of a doctor who had spent too many nights translating bad systems into survivable shifts. Late 30s. Sleeves rolled. Stethoscope hanging loose. Eyes sharp despite the fatigue. You already met Victor Lang. Nora nodded. Then you know the main one. He turned back to the board before she could answer, but the set of his jaw had told her enough. Men like Ethan did not waste energy on outrage unless they had run out of safer options. Her first hour passed in clean, hard motion. Room 7 needed troponins drawn repeat vitals, and a daughter reassured that chest pressure did not automatically mean death. Hall 3 needed a blanket, a warm voice, and someone to ignore the profanity until the medication settled in. The elderly fall in room 12 turned out to be a retired school principal, with a laceration above her left eyebrow and a blood pressure that climbed every time someone mentioned CT. Nora moved through it all with the same unhurried precision she had brought upstairs. She checked pupils while asking names. She listened to lungs while noticing who in the next room was breathing too fast. She changed a soaked gown with brisk kindness and got a line in an arm. 2 earlier attempts had failed to open. The staff around her started relying on her without meaning to. It happens that way in hospitals. Competence becomes visible before trust has time to form. At 8:15, Ethan found her finishing a neurocheck on a confused patient. You were serious about the dark, he said. She clicked off the pen light. I try not to brag before caffeine. He looked toward triage where another ambulance call had just come in. Where did you work before Richmond? Nora set the chart back in the rack. A few places. That sounds evasive. That's because it is. He studied her face, then let it go. The ER had no room tonight for curiosity that did not help keep somebody alive. A trauma alert sounded overhead just after 8:30. Motor vehicle collision. 2 adults, 1 pediatric passenger, 5 minutes out. The whole department shifted. This was the part people outside hospitals often misunderstood. Trauma does not always look dramatic at first. It looks like tightening, like everyone pulling 1 degree straighter, like jokes stopping mid-sentence, like hands reaching automatically for gloves, tape, saline, blood tubing, airway supplies. It looks like preparation made muscular through repetition. Nora stepped into that tightening as if it were familiar terrain. Ethan saw it. The charge tech saw it. Even the paramedic who burst through the ambulance bay doors saw it after a second, that this floated med-surg nurse was moving like somebody who knew how a room changed right before impact. The first patient came in semi-conscious chest wall, bruising abdomen, hardening under the sheet blood at the mouth. The child was crying in another bay. The second adult arrived pale and drifting with a femur that wanted to live at the wrong angle, and a pulse that felt like it was trying to leave. Voices sharpened. Pressure is dropping. Need another line. Get blood here now. Where is radiology? Nora was at the bedside before anyone asked. She spiked fluids, held pressure-cut fabric, repeated vitals, moved a suction line out of Ethan's way without being told. At one point, a surgical resident reached across her and nearly contaminated a field. Nora caught his wrist, redirected him half an inch, and said, "Not there. Calm. Clear. Immediate." The resident blinked at her and obeyed. A less secure man might have bristled. This one just looked relieved somebody competent had seen the mistake before it became a disaster. The trauma team pushed the first patient toward CT, with blood already hanging, and the second patient toward imaging seconds behind. The child was stable enough for observation. For 5 straight minutes, the ER felt like a body sprinting uphill. Then, all at once, the worst of the crush passed downstream. Not over, never over, but past. Ethan stripped off his gloves and looked at Nora across the trauma bay, both of them breathing a little harder than before. "You said some emergency." She tossed a bundle of bloody gauze into the red bin. "I said enough." This time he smiled fully. "You did not pick up that rhythm in med-surg. Number." He waited, but she had already turned to wipe down the rail and reset the room. Whatever she was willing to say about herself, she chose the size of it carefully. Near 9 o'clock, while the trauma rooms were still half occupied and radiology remained backed up, Nora finally sat for 30 seconds at the edge of the nurses' station to document. Rainwater streaked the ambulance bay glass beyond triage. Security escorted in a drunk man who kept singing half-remembered country lyrics. A woman in labor moaned behind a curtain, while her husband asked the registration clerk whether parking could be validated. The whole department carried on at full strain, and inside that strain, Harbor Point's deeper habits showed themselves. A registrar lowered her voice when an administrator walked through. A nurse deleted half a sentence from an incident note before signing it. A tech looked over his shoulder before saying Victor's name out loud. Nora saw all of it, not because she was searching for proof of something, but because places under fear change at the edges first. People shrink in small ways before systems admit what they have become. She had seen it in field hospitals where rank mattered too much and truth arrived too late. She had seen it in civilian units where bad leadership taught everyone to protect themselves before protecting each other. A frightened workplace has its own body language. Harbor Point spoke it fluently. At 9:20, Frank Delaney came down from 4 South for a follow-up chest film because his oxygen demand had crept up despite treatment. The transport team parked him briefly in a monitored overflow spot near the desk while radiology cleared room. Frank peered around, then squinted at Nora through his oxygen tubing. "You get around." She stepped over and adjusted the pulse oximeter clipped to his finger. "Just visiting." He looked at Ethan across the station, then back at her. "This, where the wolves live, only some nights." He settled back, then lowered his voice. Still think you answered me sideways earlier. Nora checked his tubing connection. And you still think you can play detective with 88% sats? Frank's eyes, still sharp under all that age, searched her face. Warman. She looked at him, really looked, and the corner of her mouth shifted the smallest amount. Once she said. Frank let out a quiet breath, not surprise, exactly, more like confirmation. Knew it. Keep that to yourself. He tapped 2 fingers weakly against the blanket as if saluting without the energy to lift a hand. Your secret's safe, long as you keep these city boys honest. She moved away before he could say more, but Ethan had heard enough to file the word away. Corman. That explained the field quiet in her. The economy of motion. The way stress seemed to sharpen rather than scatter her. It also raised questions Ethan did not have time to ask. At 9:47, the double doors opened again, and paramedics rolled in a new patient. Female. Early 80s. Slurred speech. Left facial droop. Weak grip on the left side. Husband, following close behind, soaked from rain, face pale under the red emergency lights. Stroke alert was called before the stretcher stopped moving. Name is Eleanor Hayes, the lead medic said. Symptoms started around 30 minutes ago, according to husband. Pressure elevated. Blood sugar normal. She was talking fine at dinner, then dropped the spoon and couldn't get the words out. Nora was already beside the stretcher when Ethan reached them. Mrs. Hayes, I'm Nora. You're in the emergency room. Can you smile for me? Eleanor tried. The left side lagged. Ethan asked rapid questions. Time last known well. Anticoagulants. Prior history. Allergies. Thomas Hayes answered too fast, his words tangling in fear and importance. My wife is a board member spouse. We know the chair personally. She cannot wait out here. Ethan did not look up from the neurologic exam. Nobody is waiting, we're moving. But Harbor Point was already jammed at its weak points. CT was occupied by the first trauma patient who had crashed again on the table and required immediate intervention. Radiology called with a 10-minute estimate that nobody believed. Lab was short-staffed. Another EMS call was inbound. A psych patient had started throwing things in Hall 3. The pregnant woman behind Curtain 6 began screaming that she felt pressure now and not later. Real emergency medicine is not tidy. It is hierarchy built second by second under conditions no one would choose. Somebody always has to wait. The only question is whether the waiting is bearable. Eleanor Hayes was frightened enough that her whole body had begun to tremble. Her husband hovered uselessly soaked cuffs dripping onto the floor. Ethan ordered stroke labs, neurochecks, blood pressure control, immediate imaging the second CT cleared. Nora, stay with her, he said. Keep her calm, watch for change. She nodded once and guided Eleanor into room 12. The room was narrow, bright, and too cold. A monitor clicked through the rhythm of an anxious heart. Rain hissed against the glass beyond the half-closed blinds. Thomas Hayes remained in the doorway trying to call somebody with hands that would not hold still. Nora took the phone gently from his grasp and lowered it. Sir, I need your wife to hear one voice right now. He stared at her offended for half a second, then overwhelmed by the fact that someone in the room sounded like they knew what to do. Tell me exactly when you noticed the spoon drop, she said. He swallowed. At dinner, 8 maybe. She looked at me like she knew something was wrong. Nora nodded. Stay where she can see you. Do not ask her to talk more than she has to. She turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Hayes squeezed my hand. The right hand tightened. The left barely answered. You're doing fine, Nora said. Do not fight the room. Just stay with me. Eleanor's eyes filled. One tear slid into her hairline. Am I dying? No, Nora said, and she said it with enough calm that the word held. You're having a bad night. We are treating a bad night. Out in the hall, the department kept moving in jagged lines. Ethan was pulled toward the laboring patient for a consult, then toward a chest pain workup whose EKG had shifted in ugly ways. Radiology still had not cleared. The trauma patient in CT was unstable. The boarder in Hall 2 had vomited all over his blanket. Phones kept ringing. Then, Thomas Hayes stepped back into the hallway and did what men with power do when fear strips away their patience. He called someone who knew someone. At first, he called a board member colleague. Then, not getting the answer he wanted fast enough, he sent a text directly to Victor Lang. "My wife is in your ER. Stroke symptoms. Why is she still waiting?" In a quieter hospital, that message might have sat unanswered for a few minutes, while reality sorted itself. Harbor Point was not a quiet hospital, and Victor Lang did not receive texts like that without feeling his authority challenged. Upstairs, in an office suite insulated by frosted glass and climate control, Victor was reviewing surgical expenditure reports when his phone lit up on the desk beside him. He read the message once, then again. The numbers in front of him blurred into something irrelevant. Outside his office, a senior assistant glanced up as the door opened hard enough to hit the stopper. Victor moved past her without a word-coat unbuttoned face, already drained of patience. Men like Victor do not distinguish well between crisis and inconvenience if both arrive wrapped in the possibility of embarrassment. Back in room 12, Eleanor's speech had grown more garbled. Thomas Hayes paced twice toward the door and twice back to the bedside. Nora checked pupils' grip airway blood pressure. Her voice stayed even low measured against the rising pulse of the room outside. There are moments in medicine when the danger is not hidden, only approaching. You feel it the way sailors feel weather before the horizon changes. In the hallway beyond room 12, wheels moved faster. Voices sharpened. Someone at the desk said Victor's name in a whisper that traveled farther than a shout. Nora lifted her eyes toward the doorway. Then she took one half-step closer to Eleanor Hayes' bed and laid a steady hand over the old woman's blanket, while the storm moved down the corridor toward them. The storm moved down the corridor toward them with polished shoes and a voice that made people forget the words in their mouths. Victor Lang did not run. He never ran. Men like him saved running for people who answered to them. He came through the emergency department at a hard, measured pace. His suit jacket open, his phone still in one hand, fury already assembled before he reached the nurse's station. The unit clerk saw him first and froze over the keyboard. A tech carrying fresh linens turned sideways to clear the path without being told. Ethan looked up from a chart and swore under his breath. Victor did not stop at the desk. "Where is Mrs. Hay?" The clerk pointed before she could stop herself. "Room 12. Ethan stepped in. "Victor, we are handling an active stroke alert and 2 trauma cases. CT is tied up." Victor cut his eyes toward him as if noticing him were an inconvenience, then untie it. That is not how radiology works. Victor did not even answer. He kept moving. At the station, Dana had just come down from 4 South with transfer paperwork and saw the whole thing from 10 feet away. She recognized the temperature in the room instantly. People had worn that same look on med-surg floors and conference rooms, outside donor luncheons, and hallways where the wrong person had been caught without witnesses. It was the look of everybody silently calculating how much damage one man could do in 60 seconds. Inside room 12, Eleanor Hayes heard him before she saw him. The old woman's pulse climbed on the monitor. Her breathing turned quick and shallow. Thomas Hayes took one step toward the door, half relieved, half panicked. "Thank God," he said. "Victor's here." Nora turned toward him. "That is not going to help her." The words were calm, but they landed hard enough to stop him. Victor appeared in the doorway a second later, broad in the frame face set in that particular expression power wears when it expects the room to make itself smaller. His eyes flicked first to Thomas Hayes, then to Eleanor in the bed, and then to Nora, standing between the bed rail and the door. Nothing in Nora's posture looked confrontational. One hand rested lightly on the blanket over Eleanor's knee. The other hung loose at her side. But she occupied the space in a way Victor recognized at once and hated on instinct. She was not moving aside. Thomas Hayes found his voice. "My wife has been waiting." Ethan reached the doorway at the same time. "She has not been neglected. CT is occupied with an unstable trauma patient." Victor raised a hand for silence without turning around. I want to hear from the nurse responsible." Nora met his eyes. She is being monitored continuously. Her neuro checks are ongoing. The scanner is tied up with an active trauma case. Victor took one step into the room. That is not an acceptable answer. It is the accurate answer. The air changed. Not because Nora raised her voice. She did not. Not because she was disrespectful. She was not. The change came because Victor had spent 5 years in buildings like this teaching people that truth belonged to him once he entered the room. And now a woman he barely knew had placed reality back where it belonged. Ethan tried once more. "Victor, this is not the place." Victor ignored him. His eyes stayed on Nora. "How long have you worked here?" "A week. And already you think you understand this hospital." Nora did not move. "I understand that your voice is making my patient worse." Thomas Hayes looked from one to the other, wet with rain and panic, suddenly unsure whether the man he had summoned was helping or lighting a match in an oxygen tent. Victor smiled then, but there was no humor in it. The smile existed to show teeth. You need to learn the difference between patient care and insubordination. Nora's thumb made one slow, reassuring pass over the blanket where Eleanor's hand trembled underneath it. "And you need to step back." In the corridor behind them, the ER had fallen into the kind of silence that does not happen because sound disappears. It happens because every person within earshot starts listening to the same danger. Dana reached the doorway and stopped. One of the techs beside the desk whispered a curse. A resident backed away from the computer so quietly the chair wheels barely squeaked. Victor took another step forward. The expensive leather of his shoes crossed the threshold until he was fully inside the room. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Nora's face did not change. "Right now I am talking to a man who is elevating a stroke patient's blood pressure." Eleanor made a frightened sound in the bed. Nora did not look away from Victor. "Mrs. Hayes," she said softly, "stay with my voice." Victor's jaw tightened. People who fear losing control often become most dangerous in the instant they realize control has already started slipping. That instant arrived in his eyes like a hardening. "I can have your badge deactivated before the hour is over." Nora answered him in the same tone she might have used to tell a family member where the ice machine was. "You can do that later. Right now, you need to leave the room." The pulse monitor went faster. Ethan moved in another half step. "Victor." Dana said Nora's name in a whisper that carried more plea than warning. Victor's gaze cut to Nora's hand on the blanket, then to the way she stood grounded and balanced, and some old ugly habit rose in him with the certainty of muscle memory. He had done this before. Not in this room, not with this woman, but enough times that his body already knew the sequence. Humiliate, break, reassert order. He lifted his right hand. Fast. Open palm. Thomas Hayes sucked in a breath so sharply it sounded like pain. Dana's mouth opened, but no words came. Ethan lunged too late. Nora moved before the strike completed its arc. Her left hand came up and caught Victor's wrist with no wasted motion, turning the force just offline. Not a grab. A redirection. Her right hand rose at the same time and settled into the joint of his elbow. Her hips turned. Her feet shifted once. The movement was almost small enough to miss if you did not understand mechanics. Victor's balance broke instantly. His knees hit tile with a crack that seemed to split the room in two. One of his shoes slid sideways. The phone flew from his hand and clattered under the visitor chair. His breath left him in a stunned grunt. Before he could twist free, Nora had his arm controlled and his shoulder folded into a position where resistance would only deepen his own loss. It took less than 2 seconds. The most feared man in Harbor Point Medical Center was on the floor at the feet of the people he had trained to fear him. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Victor tried to wrench his arm back and stopped when pain flashed bright enough across his face to teach him the limit of that idea. "Let go of me," he said. But the command had already broken apart into something smaller. Nora's voice stayed low and even. "Stop fighting." He did not stop immediately. Men like Victor never do. He bucked once, then again, and both times the hold adjusted with clinical precision, not cruel, not panicked, simply undeniable. "Let me go," he said again, and this time the words came rough. Eleanor Hayes stared from the bed, no longer looking terrified, only stunned. The monitor still ticked too fast, but her eyes had shifted from fear of the shouting to disbelief at the silence. Nora checked her once with a quick glance, then returned her attention to Victor beneath her hands. "You swung at me in front of a patient," she said. "You are done moving." The room heard it. The corridor heard it. Maybe more important, Victor heard it. For the first time in years, somebody was speaking to him as if he were the one who had become a problem to manage. He swallowed hard. His face had gone mottled, the red of rage mixing with the gray of shock. "Please," he said. The word was so small that for a second Ethan was not sure he had heard it. Then Victor said it again, louder, uglier for being forced through him. "Please, let me go." Dana's hand flew to her mouth. A clerk at the desk outside sat down without looking for a chair. The resident who had backed away from the computer stared at the doorway like a man watching a law of nature fail. Nora held the restraint for 3 more seconds. No more than that. Long enough to make sure Victor understood exactly where he was. Long enough for every person in that hallway to witness the whole shape of the thing. Long enough for fear to loosen its grip on a room. Then she released him and stepped back. Not triumphantly. Not theatrically. She simply let him go and returned to neutral shoulders, loose hands visible, breathing steady. Victor scrambled to his feet in a fury made clumsy by humiliation. His suit was wrinkled. One knee of his trousers carried a gray mark from the tile. He looked smaller, though not because his body had changed. Power had just left the room, and everyone could see the outline it had occupied. "You are fired," he snapped, voice cracking at the edges. "You assaulted me. Security. Call security right now." No one moved. Victor turned toward the door. "Did you hear me?" Dana stepped into the opening at last. She was pale, and her voice shook on the first word, but it held after that. She defended herself. Victor stared at her as if she had started speaking another language. "No," he said. "No, she attacked me." Ethan came in beside Dana. His expression had gone flat in the way physicians learn when they are done bargaining with nonsense. "I saw you raise your hand." Victor pointed at him. "Be very careful." "I am being careful." The words were quiet and devastating for that reason. Out by the desk, the respiratory tech who had been carrying tubing when Victor arrived took one step closer to the doorway. He swung first. A unit clerk from triage spoke without standing up. "I saw it too." Then another voice from the hall. "So did I." The sequence was almost visible, like a line of switches flipping on in a dark building. For years, Victor had ruled by isolating people one at a time. Public shame worked best when every witness felt alone. But fear depends on each person believing everyone else will remain silent. The second that belief cracks, the whole structure begins to fail. Victor looked from face to face and found no safe place to put his authority. His voice rose as if volume alone could restore what had vanished. "You are all out of line. Every one of you. I will suspend every person involved in this room." No one looked down. No one apologized. Nora turned slightly, just enough to put her body between Victor and the bed again. "Mrs. Hayes needs quiet," she said. That was the final insult. Not the restraint. Not the witnesses. The fact that after all of it, she still centered the patient instead of him. Security arrived less than a minute later, drawn by 3 separate calls, and the kind of alarm that spreads through emergency departments faster than overhead announcements ever could. 2 officers stepped in, alert and uncertain eyes, moving from Victor's flushed face to Nora's steady stance to Ethan, Dana, and the cluster of staff gathering in the hall. One of the officers, a former Navy Master-at-Arms named Collins, knew Victor well enough to understand immediately that whatever had happened, it was not the version Victor was about to offer. Victor pointed. "Remove her from the building." Collins did not move. "Sir, I need to know what happened. That nurse attacked me." Nora said nothing. Ethan folded his arms. Dana lifted her chin with visible effort. Then the risk management director arrived, still clutching reading glasses in one hand and looking like she had come down from a meeting she badly wished she had stayed in. Her name was Linda Shore, and unlike many people in administration, she had spent enough years in hospitals to recognize both panic and liability when she saw them standing in the same doorway. "What happened?" she asked. Victor answered first too quickly. "The nurse assaulted me after I entered to check on a board member's spouse." Linda looked at Nora. "Your statement." Nora gave it without embellishment. "Patient in room 12 with acute stroke symptoms. CT delayed due to active trauma case. CEO entered in an agitated state. Verbal escalation increased patient distress. CEO attempted to strike me. I used a defensive control hold and released when the threat ended." Linda shifted her gaze to Ethan. "That is accurate," he said. Dana nodded. "I saw it." "So did half the department," said the respiratory tech from the hallway. Victor rounded on the room. "Enough. Do you all understand what you are doing?" Nobody answered. Linda slid her glasses onto the bridge of her nose, though she did not need to read anything. The gesture seemed more about buying 1 second to think. "Mr. Lang," she said carefully, "I need you to step out of the patient care area while we assess." Victor laughed once, disbelieving. "I am the chief executive officer of this hospital." Linda did not flinch. "And at this moment you are part of an active incident." The words landed like formal paperwork. Collins shifted his stance, subtle but unmistakable. His partner did the same. For the first time, security in Harbor Point was not orbiting Victor's authority. It was containing him. Thomas Hayes had remained by the bed through all of it, his face gone slack with shock. Now he found his voice in a rasp. "Victor," he said, "just go." Victor turned toward him as if betrayed by the fact that someone he had intended to rescue no longer wanted the rescue. Eleanor made a small sound on the bed. Nora was there instantly, lowering the lights 1 notch, checking her neurostatus, re-grounding the room with touch and tone as if everything else were merely noise outside the work. "Mrs. Hayes, look at me," she said. "Can you squeeze again?" The right hand tightened. "Good, stay with me." Victor was still standing there, still trying to decide whether refusing would restore dignity or destroy it further. In the end, he chose motion because the room had made staying impossible. "This is not over," he said, but the threat came out thin. Collins opened a path in the doorway. "Sir," Victor stepped into the hall. No one moved aside quickly enough to flatter him. Staff simply created the amount of space required by physics, nothing more. As he passed the nurse's station, he saw eyes on him that did not lower. Some looked stunned. Some looked angry. 1 or 2 looked almost relieved, as if they had just watched a cracked door swing wider than they thought it could. He stopped once near the desk and turned back toward Linda. "I expect her badge revoked before the hour is out." Linda held his gaze. "We will follow procedure." Procedure. It was almost funny. For years, procedure had been the blanket thrown over his damage. Now, the same word had edges. Victor left the department with security at his shoulder. The ER did not explode the second he was gone. It did something stranger. It remained silent for a beat too long, like a body checking whether pain had really stopped before believing it. Then everything rushed back in. Phones. Monitor tones. A baby crying. Someone in triage asking for insurance. The laboring patient moaning behind curtain 6. Radiology finally calling to say CT was clear. Ethan exhaled hard and scrubbed a hand over his face. "All right, we move now. Stroke pathway." The room came alive again. Nora and Ethan pushed Eleanor toward imaging. Thomas Hayes stumbled beside the stretcher, stripped now of all his frantic importance, just a frightened husband trying to keep up. Dana took over the desk. Collins stayed near the corridor entrance. Linda Shore stepped aside to make 3 urgent calls in a voice already flattening into legal caution. At the CT doors, Ethan looked at Nora. "You all right?" She adjusted the blanket over Eleanor's legs. "I'm working." That was not my question. Nora's eyes flicked to him, then to the patient. Neither is this a good time for the other one. He almost smiled, despite the adrenaline still ringing through him. Fair enough. The scan moved quickly once the machine was free. Orders rolled, labs came back. Neurology called in. Blood pressure was managed. The old orderly pulse of medicine reclaimed the night one task at a time. By the time Eleanor returned from imaging, some color had come back to her face. Not health, not yet, but less terror. Thomas Hayes stood at the bedside, gripping the rail with both hands, rain-dried stiff on his cuffs. He looked at Nora with a complicated expression, gratitude fighting embarrassment. I thought bringing him down here would fix it. Nora checked the IV line. A lot of people think power fixes things. He nodded slowly, unable to argue. Back at the nurse's station, Dana stood with both palms braced against the counter, staring at nothing. Marisol slid a cup of stale coffee toward her. "You okay?" Dana let out a breath that trembled on the edges. "I don't know." Marisol glanced toward room 12, where Nora had just disappeared behind the curtain again. "I have worked here 11 years, she said. I have never seen anybody stop him." Dana swallowed. The coffee sat untouched. "I have," she said, after a moment. Marisol turned. "What?" Dana looked up, eyes bright in a face that had forgotten how to show fear openly. "I just did." When Nora finally returned to the desk to finish the incident documentation, the ER parted around her in a way she seemed not to notice. Not out of awe exactly, more like recalibration. Staff, who had spent years measuring themselves against Victor's moods, were now unconsciously measuring the room against something else, something steadier. Linda Shore approached with a tablet in hand. "I need a full written statement." Nora nodded. "Security footage is being pulled," Linda said. "All right." Linda hesitated, and in that hesitation the woman under the administration suit briefly surfaced. "Do you need medical evaluation?" Nora looked at her, as if the question barely made sense. "No." Linda glanced down at Nora's hands, perhaps expecting them to shake. They did not. "Fine," she said, then lowered her voice. "Do not leave the building until we finish tonight's documentation." "I am not leaving my patient." Linda accepted that with a tiny tilt of her head and moved away. Nora sat logged in and began to type. The words came clean and spare. Time, room, patient status, Victor's entry, verbal escalation, raised hand, defensive restraint, release, witnesses present, no flourish, no emotional language, just facts set down in order as precise as vitals on a flow sheet. Ethan stood beside her for a moment, reading over her shoulder without meaning to. The note read less like a complaint than an after-action report from someone used to chaos and uninterested in dramatizing it. He leaned one hip against the counter. "You've written a lot of incident reports. A few. That hold you used was not from civilian nursing orientation. Number." He waited. Nora signed the statement electronically and looked up at him. "Do you need me in room 10 or not?" Ethan let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. "Room 10. She rose and went. Near midnight, after the worst of the surge had thinned and the rain softened to a steady hiss, Dana found Nora alone for the first time since the incident. Nora was washing blood from her forearms at the sink outside the staff restroom, movement's exact water running pink for half a second before it cleared. Dana stood beside her in the fluorescent glare and listened to the faucet. Then she asked the only question that felt big enough. "Who are you?" Nora shut off the water and reached for a paper towel. For a moment she said nothing. Her face in the mirror looked tired now, but not shaken. Then she dried her hands and answered without drama. "I'm the nurse who was in the room." That should not have been enough, and somehow it was. Dana looked at her reflection, then at her directly. He begged. Nora folded the paper towel once. "Yes?" Dana's throat worked. 5 years of memory moved behind her eyes. Meetings, hallways, people disappearing from schedules, the sound of a slap no one had admitted hearing, and now this. For the first time and longer than she could remember, her voice held something like wonder instead of dread. "I didn't know he could." Nora opened the restroom door, then paused. "Most men can," she said. "They just need to be stopped long enough to remember it." Then she went back onto the floor, where monitors still pulsed and phones still rang, and Harbor Point Medical Center, for the first time in years, felt like a place where something inside the walls had shifted and would not fit back into its old shape. By the time the night shift handed off to day shift, the story had already outrun the official channels meant to contain it. It moved first through the small arteries of the hospital. A respiratory therapist told a lab tech while waiting on a blood gas. A unit clerk from emergency whispered it to a telemetry nurse over the phone. A transporter repeated it in the loading dock with both hands still wrapped around a paper cup of burnt coffee. Each version changed at the edges the way stories do when fear is mixed with relief, but the center stayed intact. Victor Lang had tried to hit a nurse in the emergency department. The nurse had put him on the floor, and witnesses had not looked away. By 6 a.m, fourth-floor med-surg knew. Intensive care knew. Radiology knew. Environmental services knew. Even the volunteers at the front desk had begun to sense the hospital moving under a pressure nobody had names for yet. Harbor Point had spent years functioning like a place with sealed doors and buried records, but secrecy in hospitals is always thinner than executives imagine. Too many people carry trays, read charts, answer calls, wheel stretchers, and overhear the truth while doing work considered too ordinary to notice. Nora Bennett finished her documentation sometime after 1, stayed long enough to help stabilize Eleanor Hayes through the first phase of stroke management, and finally walked out of the ER just before dawn with dried fatigue sitting under her eyes. She had changed nothing about her appearance except for a fresh pair of scrub pants after blood from the trauma bay soaked the knee of the first set. Her hair was still tied back. Her badge still hung straight. She looked less like someone who had just become the subject of every whispered conversation in the building than someone coming off a long clinical shift with one too many admissions. Dana found her at the employee exit standing with a paper cup from the vending machine and watching rainwater gather along the curb outside. "I thought they told you not to leave until Risk signed off." "They did." Nora took a sip and looked at the gray line of morning. Then they signed off. Dana stood beside her without speaking for a while. Delivery trucks hissed through the wet parking lot. Somewhere beyond the garages, gulls were calling over the river. The city was waking up, but the hospital had not slept. Finally, Dana said, "People are talking." Nora gave a faint nod. "That happens. You don't seem surprised." "Number." Dana studied the side of her face. "Are you scared?" Nora took another sip before answering. "I'm tired." That was not evasion exactly. It was a different ordering of priorities. Dana felt it and let the question die. They stood there in silence long enough for the automatic doors behind them to open and shut twice. Then Dana said what had been sitting in her chest since midnight. He raised his hand like he'd done it before. Nora looked at her then. He had. Dana's mouth tightened. "I mean, in front of me, in front of everyone," like he expected the room to agree with him. Nora turned her eyes back toward the rain. Because that room usually did. The words stung because they were true. Dana swallowed. "Not this time." "No," Nora said, "not this time." By 9 o'clock, Human Resources had locked itself into a conference room on the administrative floor, with legal counsel dialed in risk management stacked with folders, and the sort of strained, coffee-fueled seriousness institutions summon when the damage has finally become expensive enough to name. The first thing they pulled was Nora Bennett's personnel file. Melissa from Orientation, the same woman who had handed out policy packets in a beige room 3 days earlier, sat at the end of the table looking as though she regretted every moment of her career that had led to this one. She slid the file toward Linda Shore from Risk Management. Her references checked out. Licenses clean. Prior employers all confirmed service dates. Linda flipped through the pages once, then again slower this time. A regular nursing resume becomes irregular when you read it against what people witnessed in room 12. 10 years in civilian nursing. Critical care and emergency cross-training. Strong evaluations. A note on advanced crisis de-escalation certification. Several years at a regional medical center outside Richmond. Before that, a gap, not really a gap at all, once Linda reached the attached service records. Fleet Marine Force corpsman, attached to Marine infantry units, multiple overseas deployments, combat casualty care, advanced close quarters defensive training. Linda looked up over the file. Why was this not flagged? Melissa blinked. Flagged for what? For being relevant. Melissa's hands tightened around her pen. She applied for a nursing role. She also used a defensive control technique in the emergency department that dropped the CEO in under 2 seconds. One of the attorneys on speaker cleared his throat. For the record, that may work in our favor if the force used was trained limited and proportional. Linda turned another page. It was. Silence settled over the room for a beat. People often expect military history to announce itself loudly. They imagine stiff posture, barked words, old trauma worn on the surface. Nora's file suggested something more disciplined and harder to read. She had not advertised any of it in the interview process beyond what credentialing required. She had simply carried it with her into civilian life and let people make whatever assumptions they wanted. Linda closed the file and said the thing that changed the tone of the room. She did not improvise. In the hours that followed, witness statements arrived faster than HR had planned for and more detailed than Victor had ever allowed in previous complaints. That alone told Linda Shore the balance of fear inside Harbor Point had shifted overnight. Dana came in first. She sat straight backed across from the external investigator and kept both hands wrapped around a cup she never drank from. At the start, her voice shook. 8 years under Victor had trained her body to anticipate punishment long before her mind could argue against it. But once she began, the truth came with the force of something held too long. She described his rounds through patient units, and the way staff went quiet at the sound of his shoes. She described nurses being humiliated over supply costs in front of family members. She described a young unit secretary slapped in a side hallway after interrupting a donor event. She described a recovery room nurse who went home in tears so often her husband began sitting up awake to wait for her because he no longer trusted what condition she would come through the door in. She described the way complaints disappeared. The investigator, a gray-haired former labor attorney named Ellen Pike, kept her voice level and her questions short. When did you first believe Mr. Lang was physically dangerous? Dana looked down into the untouched coffee. The first time I heard him hit someone. Heard, not saw. I saw the aftermath. Red cheek, broken composure. The rest of us pretending not to know. Why didn't you report it then? Dana laughed, once a terrible sound. To who? That answer sat in the room like a second witness. Ethan Park came next. His statement was cleaner, less emotional, but no less damaging. He walked through the ER timeline with medical specificity. Trauma occupancy. CT delay. Blood pressure risk in acute stroke. Verbal escalation at the bedside. Victor's physical movement into the room. The raised hand. Nora's response. Was the force excessive? Ellen Pike asked. No, Ethan said. You answered quickly. Because I know what excessive force looks like. He folded his hands on the table. She controlled him. She did not strike him. She did not continue once he stopped resisting. She released him as soon as the threat ended. Linda Shore made a note. Ethan's eyes shifted toward the window of the conference room, not seeing the administrative wing beyond it, so much as the ER as it had looked the night before. You want the truth, he said. The unusual part is not what she did. The unusual part is that everyone finally said out loud what he is. That statement never made it into any formal memo, but several people in the room remembered it later. By midday, the list of employees asking to speak with the investigator had grown long enough to require a second schedule sheet. Some came in angry. Some came in pale and shaking. Some opened their mouths and cried before they got 3 words out because the body has its own memory for humiliation, and being invited to revisit it in a room with closed doors and note-taking strangers can feel too much like the old trap, even when the purpose is justice. A telemetry nurse described Victor screaming at her in front of a patient family because a transfer order had been delayed by bed management. A surgical tech described being cornered by him in a supply hallway after correctly informing a surgeon that an instrument tray had been contaminated. A respiratory therapist named Claire Morgan gave the investigator a photograph she had taken of bruises on her upper arm 4 years earlier, after Victor grabbed her hard enough to leave marks when she contradicted him about ventilator timing in front of a department chair. "Did you file a complaint?" Ellen asked. Claire's laugh was dry and thin. "I filed 3. What happened? 2 meetings, 1 apology to him for causing disruption, and my night shifts doubled for the next month." The hospital's language came back again and again in the interviews. Disruption, tone, professionalism, alignment. Harbor Point had hidden its violence inside vocabulary polished enough to survive email chains and board packets. Around 1 in the afternoon, a records specialist from HR named Owen appeared at Linda Shore's door, holding a cardboard archive box. "I think you should see these." The box had come from a locked file cabinet in the HR records room, the sort of cabinet no one opens unless legal specifically asks. Inside were older complaints, some formally logged, some, not all, stamped with dates from the first 3 years of Victor's tenure. There were incident narratives, follow-up notes, witness interviews that stopped abruptly halfway through collection, an unsigned memorandum recommending executive coaching instead of disciplinary action, a draft settlement letter, 2 non-disclosure agreements, 1 photograph of a split lip with the employee name redacted in black marker. Linda read in silence until her face lost what color it still had. There it was. Not rumor, not morale, not interpersonal conflict. A record. Incomplete, compromised, handled with institutional cowardice, but real. She called legal back in. "This is no longer a question of isolated claims," she said. "This is a pattern with documented internal awareness." The attorney on speaker did not soften his answer. "Then the exposure is severe." Meanwhile, Victor Lang remained in his office suite pretending he still occupied the same world as everyone else. He came in that morning at the usual time. Same dark suit, same polished shoes, same assistant at the desk outside. But the performance had gone wrong at the edges. He signed 1 memo twice because he forgot he had already done it. He asked for a meeting with the chief financial officer, then canceled it after 5 minutes, and told the assistant to reschedule all administrative rounds until further notice. He phoned the board chair and reached voicemail. He called again. Voicemail again. At 10:30, he summoned the chief nursing officer and demanded to know why the nurse involved had not already been suspended. The chief nursing officer, a woman named Renee Foster, who had spent 3 years surviving by careful compromise, sat rigid in the chair opposite his desk. "Because an external investigation is active," she said. Victor leaned back and threaded his fingers together as if calm were something he could still wear. Then suspend her pending review. Renee did not meet his eyes. "That has not been recommended." "By whom?" "Legal." Victor stared at her for several long seconds. "You are letting 1 nurse dictate terms to this institution." Renee's face tightened, but something about the last 12 hours had altered her capacity for agreeing to things she did not believe. "No," she said quietly. "I think what happened is that witnesses gave statements." Victor stood so fast, the chair behind him rolled backward. "She assaulted me." Renee stood too, though more slowly. "That is not what the statements say." The silence that followed was no longer the familiar kind. It did not protect him. It measured him. When Renee left, Victor remained standing behind his desk with both hands braced flat on the polished wood. Through the office window he could see the parking deck, and beyond it, the faint gray line of the river. None of it looked changed. But inside the building, people who had once lowered their voices when his name came up were now speaking into recorders and signing statements. He called 3 department heads before noon. 1 did not answer. 1 answered and sounded ill. The 3rd listened to Victor describe the investigation as a gross overreaction driven by an unstable employee, then said in a thin voice that all requests for staff contact should go through legal for the time being. Victor lowered the phone and stared at it as if the object itself had betrayed him. While administration spiraled upstairs, Nora slept for almost 4 hours in her apartment across town, woke to a silent phone full of missed calls, and stood under the shower long enough for the steam to lift some of the hospital smell from her skin. Her apartment was spare but not empty. Books on a shelf, running shoes by the door, a folded American flag in a shadow box near the hallway table. Nothing sentimental on display, except a single framed photograph turned slightly away from the room. A woman in her late 50s, smiling in hospital headscarf and cardigan, one hand wrapped around Nora's wrist with the unconscious affection of someone who trusted touch more than words. Nora dried off, made coffee, and finally checked her voicemail. Dana had called once. Linda Shore had called twice. An unknown number had called from the hospital switchboard, then hung up without leaving a message. Last of all, there was a voicemail from a number in Richmond. The voice belonged to Father Michael, from the church her mother had attended in the last year of her illness. Nora Dana Keller from the hospital reached out. She said, "Things have become complicated. I only wanted to say this. Your mother used to tell people that peace was not the same as surrender. She was proud of you before she had any reason to know what you would be asked to carry. Call if you need anything." Nora stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand and let the coffee machine click itself off. For a moment, the apartment changed shape around memory. Her mother, in a chemotherapy recliner with a blanket over her knees, the antiseptic air of the oncology floor, the shared room during one bad week when beds were short and the woman behind the dividing curtain could not sleep without talking. A former nurse from Harbor Point named Michelle's voice burned flat by too many humiliations. She had spoken to Nora's mother in the dark while IV pumps chirped and moonlight cut a line across the linoleum. He slapped a girl over a donor meeting. They made us apologize for the complaints. I loved nursing until I worked there. Nora had listened from the visitor chair, jaw tight, saying almost nothing. Months later, after the hospice bed came into the house and the oxygen concentrator hummed day and night, her mother had reached for her hand with surprising strength. "You were trained to run toward bad things," she had whispered. "Do not let that training turn into hiding. Use it where it matters." Nora had kissed her forehead and said nothing, because promises made to the dying are often too large to answer in the moment. Now, standing in her kitchen with rain drying on the windows and the hospital breathing through her voicemail, she set the phone down and drank her coffee without sugar. Back at Harbor Point, the investigation pushed into history. Ellen Pike requested prior employer records. Legal began pulling executive references from Victor's file. 2 old hospital systems in North Carolina and Tennessee returned cautious responses that became less cautious once Harbor Point's attorneys invoked formal inquiry language. Then, one former employee called the investigator directly. Her name was Michelle Rodriguez, and she had worked under Victor when he was chief operating officer at a mid-size hospital outside Charlotte. Her voice on the phone was careful at first, the way people speak when they have learned that institutions can turn any uncertainty against them. "I heard he's finally under investigation," she said. "He is," Ellen replied. Michelle was quiet for a long beat. Then she exhaled. "I kept everything." They scheduled a video interview that same evening. Michelle appeared on screen from a dining room table with a stack of folders beside her, and the kind of controlled expression people wear when they have rehearsed calm because collapse would waste time. She had been an ICU nurse, then interim charge, then gone from healthcare altogether after filing a complaint Victor buried with practiced ease. He liked to isolate one person at a time, she said, always in a way that left enough doubt for everyone else to retreat. You'd think you were the only one. Then, later, another nurse would pull you aside and say it happened to her, too. She held up copies of emails she had sent herself after incidents. Dates, times, witness names, a note about Victor cornering her after she challenged staffing ratios. A later message describing him gripping her shoulder hard enough to leave nail marks through scrubs. "Why keep all this?" Ellen asked. Michelle gave a tired smile that held no humor. because part of me knew the truth would need a body someday. She was not the last. A nurse from Nashville sent archived complaint records from a previous hospital system where Victor had left after what administrators called an administrative restructuring. A former case manager provided text messages to her sister from 7 years earlier, describing a public humiliation so severe she vomited in the employee bathroom after it ended. Little by little, the picture widened. Victor had not become dangerous at Harbor Point. He had arrived dangerous and been promoted anyway. The local press caught the scent on the second day. A reporter from the Norfolk Ledger called public relations with a question so politely phrased, it was obvious she already knew more than she was saying. We've received information concerning an internal investigation involving executive conduct in the emergency department. Can the hospital comment? Public Relations sent back a standard statement about ongoing review patient privacy and commitment to a safe workplace. The reporter printed a shorter version of that statement than PR wanted and paired it with a line sourced to 2 anonymous employees confirming multiple witness interviews. The article went live before dinner. Nothing in it was especially dramatic. There were no names beyond Victor's, no lurid detail. Just enough truth to invite more truth. A hospital CEO under investigation. Staff interviews ongoing. Questions raised about prior complaints and institutional oversight. Once the story crossed from whisper to print, Harbor Point's phone lines lit up with former employees wanting to talk to someone who might finally listen. Some had left nursing altogether. Some still worked in medicine, but in different cities, different systems far enough away to risk speech. Some cried on the phone before they introduced themselves. Karen Williams called just before 7. She had been an oncology nurse at Victor's prior hospital and now worked in medical billing because she had never found her way back to bedside care after what happened under him. "I have not touched a patient in 5 years," she said. "I still dream about call lights." Ellen Pike kept her voice gentle. "Take your time." Karen's story came out in fragments. Public correction. Escalating hostility. One medication dispute where Karen had refused to give a dose before clarifying an order. Victor had slapped her in a corridor with 2 patients' family members nearby. She filed. HR investigated. The witnesses became uncertain. She was told the event could not be substantiated and advised to consider counseling for work-related stress. She did. The counseling confirmed what no institution would say plainly to her. The problem was not that she had become too fragile for nursing. The problem was that someone dangerous had been placed above consequence. "I left because I could not keep swallowing my own reality," she said. After the call ended, Ellen remained seated with her hand over the notebook in front of her. Some testimonies bruise the room even after the speaker is gone. Linda Shore, who had sat through the interview in silence, finally said what everyone else was thinking. This will not stay inside the hospital. It already had not. That night, as staff moved through the cafeteria with their phones lit under the tables, Harbor Point's secret began to leave the building entirely. A physician texted the article to a former colleague. A nurse sent the link to her sister with the message, "You remember what I told you." Someone on social media posted that a local hospital executive was finally getting looked at for years of abuse. The post gathered comments from people who had heard rumors, then from people who had not heard rumors at all, but understood enough about healthcare to know how often institutions protect revenue before workers. Victor went home late, though home was not really the right word for the house he entered that night. It was a large waterfront property with minimalist furniture, expensive art, and no softness anywhere in it. He loosened his tie in the foyer and found the silence wrong, not peaceful, waiting. He poured bourbon, opened the article on his tablet, and read it standing at the kitchen island, as if refusing to sit might keep the language from becoming real. Internal investigation, multiple employee interviews, prior complaints, safe workplace. He set the glass down hard enough to splash amber across the stone. Then he began composing messages to a board member who owed him favors, to an attorney he had used for executive contract disputes, to a consultant in reputation management. He told each of them in different language that the matter was being distorted by emotional staff and one unstable nurse with a military background. He described himself as the target of an overreaction. He emphasized his track record, his profitability, his strategic value. The words came faster as the night went on, but they had begun to lose the force he once trusted in them. Every message carried a shape beneath it that he could feel and not correct. Pleading. Back at Harbor Point, Nora returned the next day in clean scrubs and a rain jacket badge clipped in its usual place, as if the entire hospital were not orbiting her name. She checked in with Linda Shore, gave a supplemental statement concerning the exact physical mechanics of the restraint, and then went upstairs to work a scheduled shift, because staffing was short and patient care had not paused to accommodate scandal. When she stepped onto 4 South, conversation dipped for a beat, and then resumed in a new register, one she recognized immediately. Not celebrity. Not gossip. Reorientation. Marisol at the desk blinked at her. "You came back." Nora signed into the charting system. "I work here." "That is not what I meant." Nora looked up. "I know." Dana emerged from the medroom with a cup of applesauce and a medication packet. She stopped in front of Nora and searched her face as if confirming the woman in front of her was the same one from the ER. "Did you sleep?" "A little." Dana handed the applesauce to an aide passing by. "There are 3 people on this unit who want to hug you and 6 who want to salute you." Nora almost smiled. "Please discourage both." Dana's mouth twitched for the first time in days. "I can try." Then the call lights started again. A patient needed pain medication, a family member wanted updates, and the work pulled everyone back into motion. That was the strange grace of hospitals. Even in scandal, even in fear, bodies still needed turning lungs, still needed listening to meds, still needed double checks. Wounds still needed dressing. The ordinary demands of care steadied what power had destabilized. At 10 that morning, Linda Shore sent a calendar notice to the board for an emergency closed session. By noon, legal had prepared a preliminary exposure summary. By evening, Victor's assistant had stopped pretending the calls were normal. And in conference rooms, break rooms, patient rooms, and hallways where the light always seemed too sharp, Harbor Point Medical Center kept speaking the truth out loud to itself, piece by piece, until silence no longer felt like the natural state of the place at all. Silence no longer felt like the natural state of the place at all. And that was what truly frightened the people who had once mistaken silence for stability. 3 days after the incident in room 12, Harbor Point's board assembled on the top floor, under a gray Norfolk sky, and the kind of tension money cannot soften. The conference room had been designed to impress donors and reassure investors. Long walnut table, frosted glass, river view beyond the rain, a wall lined with framed photographs of ribbon cuttings, capital campaign smiling executives in white coats and dark suits. Every image on that wall suggested control. Every person in the room knew control had already slipped elsewhere. Victor Lang arrived early. He wore charcoal wool silver cufflinks and the expression of a man trying to force reality back into an old shape through posture alone. He set his leather portfolio at the table, greeted no one, and remained standing as directors filtered in. Some nodded at him out of habit. Others avoided looking at him directly, which irritated him more than open hostility would have. Open hostility he could fight. Withdrawal was harder. Withdrawal suggested calculation, suggested survival. The board chair, Malcolm Reeves, came in last with outside counsel and 2 folders tucked under one arm. Reeves had defended Victor more than once over the years, usually with the smooth confidence of a man who believed a profitable executive was worth inconvenience elsewhere. This morning, his face looked older. Not remorseful exactly, just alert to cost in a way it had not been before. "We will begin as soon as counsel is ready," Reeves said. Victor remained standing. Before that happens, I want it entered plainly that I have been the target of an unprofessional and physically aggressive act by an employee whose conduct is being distorted by emotional staff response. No one answered him immediately. The hospital's outside counsel, Andrea Bloom, took her seat and opened a file. "You will have an opportunity to respond." Victor heard the phrase and hated it on instinct. Opportunity to respond. Language built for defendants. He lowered himself into the chair with controlled force and folded his hands on the table. Downstairs, the hospital worked around the hearing because hospitals always do. Stroke patients still needed monitoring. A child in pediatrics still had a fever of 103. A man on 6 West still could not catch his breath without panic rising in him before the nebulizer ever started. People in pain never pause because an institution has finally been dragged into honesty. Nora Bennett knew the hearing had begun because Linda Shore sent a one-line message to her hospital phone. "Board in session." That was all. Nora looked at the screen while standing outside room 428 with a medication cup in one hand and a chart in the other. Then she slid the phone back into the scrub pocket and went in to explain anticoagulants to a retired electrician who wanted to know whether the pills would make him bleed if he shaved too quickly. His wife had tears in her eyes for reasons that had nothing to do with the boardroom upstairs. Nora sat on the edge of the chair, spoke slowly, and told them what they needed to hear in language shaped to their fear instead of the chart. When she stepped back into the hall, Dana was waiting at the desk, pretending to organize transfer papers. "You got the message?" "Yes." Dana did not ask if Nora was nervous. She had already learned that Nora carried nerves differently from most people. If the feeling was there, it folded inward and became focus. They asked whether you would come up if they wanted direct testimony. Nora scanned a medication barcode and said, "Then I'll go if they ask." Dana watched her for a beat. "That is all you have to say about it." Nora signed off the scan. Patients first. It was not a slogan with her. It was order. It kept the world sorted. Upstairs order was harder to maintain. The first hour of the board session belonged to facts, which made it the hardest hour for Victor to endure. Facts do not care how much a man once frightened other people. Facts accumulate under doors inside inboxes in witness statements signed by hands that still shake and are signed anyway. Andrea Bloom walked the board through the external investigation with lawyerly calm. Witness list. Timeline of the emergency department incident. Review of prior complaints. Records recovered from human resources. Emerging documentation from Victor's former institutions. The language stayed professional. The content did not. 43 current and former employees had provided statements. 9 described direct physical intimidation. Multiple prior complaints had been known internally and closed without meaningful disciplinary action. 2 settlements had involved non-disclosure agreements. Cross-institutional patterns were now being corroborated. Victor interrupted twice in the first 15 minutes. "These are allegations." Bloom did not look up from the file. "Some are allegations. Some are internal records. Some are witness-corroborated events. Some are your own prior communications." Victor leaned forward. "You are presenting this as if there were no effort made to manage difficult employees." Bloom lifted her eyes at that. "Assault is not employee management." The sentence sat in the room like a dropped instrument no one wanted to touch. Malcolm Reeves cleared his throat. "Proceed." Then came the clips from recorded interviews, not video. Audio excerpts selected by counsel because hearing a human voice often does what typed transcripts do not. Dana's voice trembled in the first 10 seconds, then steadied when she described the sound of a slap in a donor hallway and the red imprint left on a young woman's cheek. Ethan Park's voice remained clean and measured while explaining stroke destabilization and the limited proportionate nature of Nora's response. Claire Morgan described bruises on her arm. Karen Williams, speaking from another city, went silent for almost 12 seconds in the middle of her account before saying she still dreamed of call lights she would never answer again, because Victor had driven her out of the profession she once loved. Victor stared at the polished table through most of it. He knew better than to show visible agitation in front of directors, but the muscles in his jaw had started to pulse beneath the skin, and by the time Michelle Rodriguez's voice came over the speaker from Charlotte describing him as a man who learned how to move from institution to institution before consequences could catch up, Victor's right hand had tightened around his pen hard enough to bend the clip. "This is character assassination," he said. No one corrected him. No one defended him either. When the request came for Nora Bennett to join the session, the message reached 4 South through 2 layers of administration and 1/2 whispered relay. Dana found Nora finishing an assessment on a woman recovering from bowel surgery. "They're ready." Nora nodded, once checked the incision dressing, and told the patient she would return after lunch with the next round of pain medication. The elevator ride up was quiet. Linda Shore stood beside her holding a tablet she had not looked at in a full minute. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was operational. At the top-floor lobby, Linda finally said, "You are not under review in there. You understand that?" Nora glanced at the mirrored elevator door as it opened. "I understand that nothing in that room is truly simple." Linda accepted the answer because it was the right one. The boardroom fell still when Nora entered. She wore clean navy scrubs, no jacket hair tied back, badge clipped straight. She had come directly from patient care, and the contrast between her and Victor did more work than any prepared statement could have. He looked assembled for authority. She looked assembled for usefulness. Malcolm Reeves gestured toward the chair halfway down the table. "Miss Bennett, thank you for coming." Nora sat, folded her hands, waited. "Please describe the events of Friday evening in the emergency department," Andrea Bloom said. Nora did. She did not dramatize. She did not perform injury. She gave the room a sequence because sequence is how trained people preserve truth under pressure. Patient presentation. CT delay due to unstable trauma case. Verbal escalation by Victor in the doorway. Increase in patient distress. Verbal instruction to de-escalate. Victor's approach into her space. Raised hand. Defensive control hold. Release when threat ended. Bloom asked, "Did you intend to injure him?" Number. "Did you strike him?" Number. "Why did you physically engage at all?" "To stop an imminent strike and protect the patient behind me." "Did you use more force than necessary?" Number. Bloom paused, then asked the question everyone in the room had been circling since this began. "How were you able to respond so quickly?" Victor's eyes lifted for the first time in several minutes. Nora answered him as much as the board. "I was trained to stop violence without escalating it." "What training?" "Fleet Marine Force Corpsman, Close Quarters Defensive Control, Casualty Protection." No one wrote for a moment. Even people who had read the personnel file reacted differently to hearing the words from her own mouth. They gave shape to what the witnesses had described in fragments. Calm under pressure, precision, lack of panic, use of force measured to the inch rather than the emotion. Reeves leaned forward. "Why did you not disclose that background more directly during your hiring process?" Nora held his gaze. "I applied to work as a nurse." Reeves sat back. The answer was not disrespectful. It simply refused to apologize for being more than they expected. Bloom asked one final question. "If the same conditions repeated, what would you do?" Nora did not hesitate. "Protect the patient, stop the strike, release when the threat ended." She spoke like someone reading an order she had already accepted inside herself. Victor finally broke. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You are letting a nurse with military conditioning reframe an act of aggression as heroism." Nora turned her head and looked at him fully for the first time since entering the room. Her voice stayed even. "You raised your hand at me in front of a stroke patient." There was no heat in it, no desire to humiliate him, only placement of fact. Victor rose halfway from his chair. "You do not speak to me that way." Malcolm Reeves's voice sharpened. "Sit down." Victor froze one hand on the table. For years, the command structure at Harbor Point had run one direction. Now, another man had used an order word on him in front of witnesses, and the room had accepted it as natural. Victor sat. The board dismissed Nora after that. As she rose, she glanced once toward the rain on the windows and then toward Andrea Bloom, as if mentally confirming there was nothing else useful left for her to do there. She left the room without looking back. Linda Shore walked her to the elevator lobby. "You did well," Linda said. Nora pressed the down button. "I told the truth." "Yes," Linda replied. "That is rarer than it should be." When the elevator doors opened, Nora stepped in and rode back toward the floors where truth still had to be turned into care, one blood pressure reading at a time. The board moved into executive session without Victor. Security escorted him to an adjacent conference room at Bloom's request, and although they did it respectfully, the humiliation was total. He had once summoned security the way kings summon servants. Now, 2 uniformed officers stood by while he paced a carpeted room too small for his anger and too bright for his self-image. In the boardroom, the conversation finally stripped itself of euphemism. Malcolm Reeves removed his glasses and laid them on the table. "We have a catastrophic governance failure." One director, a venture capitalist from Richmond, who had previously praised Victor's financial discipline at every annual review, kept his eyes fixed on the packet in front of him. "How much of this did we know?" Andrea Bloom answered without mercy. "Enough to have asked harder questions years ago." Another director said he delivered results. Bloom looked at him. He delivered exposure. The older woman on the board, a retired judge named Evelyn Sloan, who had been one of the few to raise concerns about Harbor Point's nursing turnover long before the ER incident, spoke next. "Let us stop pretending the problem here is only legal. The problem is that we were willing to benefit from a climate we never had to stand inside." No one replied to that because it was true in a way argument could not improve. They talked severance, licensing notification, probable civil claims, media strategy, interim leadership, crisis, containment, federal reporting obligations, and the practical question of how to remove a CEO without detonating what remained of staff trust. But under all the polished language lay a simpler reality. Victor Lang could no longer remain in power without forcing the board to publicly own him. None of them were willing to do that now. The vote was not close. Termination for cause. Effective immediately. No severance. Mandatory reporting to relevant professional authorities. Retention of independent counsel to review prior complaint handling. When Malcolm Reeves signed the resolution, his hand paused for one visible second at the signature line. The pause did not redeem him. It merely showed that for the first time he understood the weight of ink. Security entered Victor's waiting room minutes later with Bloom and Reeves behind them. Victor looked up and read the answer in their faces before either man spoke. "No," he said. Reeves folded his hands in front of him. "The board has voted to terminate your employment for cause effective immediately." Victor let out a short laugh that sounded more frightened than amused. "You are making a mistake." Bloom slid the resolution across the table. "The hospital will provide formal notice. Your access will be revoked once you retrieve personal items under supervision." Victor did not touch the paper. "You need me," he said. Nobody in the room answered. He tried again, sharper now. "You built this institution on the numbers I delivered." Reeves's face did not change, and ignored what those numbers were costing. Victor looked from one to the other, searching for the old leverage points. Gratitude. Fear. Ambition. None of them held. For a moment, he seemed to shrink inward, not physically, but structurally, like a building discovering rot at its center. Then rage took over because rage was more familiar than collapse. "This nurse," he said, turning toward Bloom, as if the whole boardroom could still be reordered around his grievance. "This woman set this in motion. She targeted me." Bloom's voice stayed level. "Your own conduct set this in motion." That ended it. Not because Victor agreed. Because there was nowhere left to place denial that would do useful work. They walked him to his office. The administrative corridor had never felt long to him before. Now every step seemed to happen inside too much light. Assistants looked up from desks and then down again, but not fast enough to hide what they had seen. A financial analyst stepped out of a copy room and stopped cold with a stack of paper in his hands. Renee Foster from Nursing Administration stood near the elevators with Linda Shore and did not move aside. Victor opened his office door with a keycard that would work only this one last time. Inside, the room still smelled faintly of his cologne and leather chairs and the citrus polish facilities used on the credenza. A framed award from a healthcare leadership summit stood beside a crystal donor plaque. Family photographs were limited and carefully chosen: a watch box, 2 fountain pens, a set of golf tees, and a dish by the window, the artifacts of a man who believed curation could substitute for character. Security waited while he packed. He tried at first to preserve dignity through slowness. He placed items carefully into a cardboard banker's box, straightened the lid on the watch case, lifted the framed award as if it still meant something stable. But dignity requires witness on your own terms, and that was gone. What remained was inventory. At last, he picked up the final photograph from his desk and stopped. It was him at a donor gala, smiling under chandeliers, hand on the shoulder of a board member whose name would now not return his calls. He set the frame into the box face down. When he emerged into the corridor carrying it, the hospital had already begun to know. News travels with astonishing speed once power changes direction. The same people who once flinched at the sound of his footsteps now stood in doorways and behind desks and watched him pass without lowering their eyes. On 4 South Dana heard the elevator rumor before the central supply rumor, and both before Linda Shore's email made it official. By then, 3 nurses had already found reasons to walk past the far end of the administrative hall. One came back crying quietly in the break room without fully understanding why. Relief often breaks the body in the same place fear used to live. Victor crossed the lobby with security beside him and rain hammering against the glass beyond the entrance. The volunteer at the front desk, a widow in her 70s who had once watched him berate a registrar over visitor badges, folded her hands and simply observed. The doors opened. Wet air came in. Victor stepped outside with the box in his arms, and his entire future reduced to the walk between the entrance and the black sedan waiting under the awning. The parking lane shone with rain. His shoes darkened at the edges. He did not look back at the hospital. People said later that he could not. Others said he would not. Both were probably true. By the time the car disappeared beyond the garage ramp, Harbor Point exhaled in pieces. Not celebration, not yet. Just release. A charge nurse in ICU sat down in an empty family room and cried for 3 minutes, then wiped her face and went back to titrating drips. A registration clerk in emergency laughed once in pure disbelief and then clapped a hand over her mouth. Ethan Park stood at the charting station reading the email from administration and felt his shoulders drop half an inch lower than they had in years. Dana found Nora in room 431, helping an elderly man roll onto his side so she could check a pressure area. Email just went out, Dana said. Nora eased the pillow into place behind the patient's back. All right, he's gone. Nora pulled the blanket up and made sure the call light was within reach before she turned. Then we keep working. Dana stared at her, then let out something between a laugh and a broken breath. How are you this calm? Nora glanced back at the patient who was drifting towards sleep now that someone had finally taken the time to make him comfortable. Because this part matters more, she said. In the days that followed, the legal machinery began to grind with the patience of heavy equipment. 3 former victims filed criminal complaints. Civil attorneys reached out to current and former employees with questions about hostile workplace exposure. The State Medical Board opened a review into Victor's physician license and executive conduct. Reporters called again, now with sharper questions and better sources. Harbor Point's lawyers stopped trying to avoid the story and started trying to survive it. The board appointed an interim CEO within the month. Dr. Julia Monroe arrived from a respected hospital system in North Carolina with a reputation for rebuilding damaged cultures and no appetite for ornamental leadership. She was in her early 50s, internally composed, and had the unnerving habit of listening until other people filled the silence with whatever they had been trying not to say. Her first week did not begin with a press event. It began with chairs and circles. She held listening sessions on every major unit. No slides, no slogans, no public relations language. Just staff coffee tissues and one repeated question. What made it hard to speak here? At first, people answered carefully, then less carefully, then honestly. They talked about fear of retaliation, shift manipulation, performance reviews used as weapons, complaints buried in process, the way bad behavior became normalized when enough people were forced to adjust around it. They talked about what it had done to patient care, though this part often came through indirectly. Delayed speaking up, hesitating to question orders, nurses spending precious emotional energy tracking a man's mood instead of their own clinical judgment. Julia Monroe did not defend the institution. She wrote things down. When someone said, "We need to know reporting actually goes somewhere," she wrote that down too and circled it twice. Within 6 weeks, changes began moving from promise into policy. Anonymous reporting mechanisms were outsourced to an independent vendor. Executive conduct complaints bypassed standard chain of command and went directly to external review. Mandatory leadership training was rewritten around dignity, not optics. Retention interviews replaced some exit interviews because Julia wanted to know why people were still staying, not only why they had fled. Human resources was audited. Files were reopened. An internal workplace safety committee was created with actual clinical staff on it, not just administrators. None of it healed the place overnight. Hospitals do not recover from years of fear the way television dramas recover after commercial break. Trauma lingers in body memory. Nurses still stiffened when a firm male voice rose around a corner. Unit secretaries still checked caller ID before answering internal lines. Several employees cried the first time they disagreed openly with a supervisor and nothing bad happened after. That was how deep Victor's culture had run. It had trained the nervous system. Nora understood that better than most. When Julia Monroe asked her to join the new workplace safety task force, Nora declined at first. "I am a staff nurse," she said. Julia sat across from her in a vacant consult room with a legal pad on her knee. "You are a staff nurse people trust. That can be enough." "It can," Julia said. "It can also be the start of something else." Nora looked through the narrow window in the door at the corridor beyond, where a transporter pushed a patient toward imaging, and a family member hurried after them carrying a phone charger and fear in equal measure. "I am not interested in being symbolic," she said. Julia's answer came without delay. "Good, I need useful." That was how Nora joined. Not as a hero, not as a mascot for reform, as a clinician whose calm carried weight with the people most damaged by what Harbor Point had been. She helped build de-escalation protocols rooted in reality rather than policy theater. She reviewed staff safety procedures with security and insisted they be written for the floors, as they actually functioned, not as administrators imagined them from offices. She spoke in orientation sessions briefly and plainly about advocacy chain of command documentation and the difference between respect and submission. New hires listened to her because she never sounded performative. She sounded like someone who had lived the stakes. Dana watched the effect before anyone could quantify it. A first-year nurse challenged a confusing order during rounds and did not apologize for asking the clarifying question. A respiratory therapist reported a supervisor's outburst the same afternoon it happened, instead of carrying it for 6 months. 2 nurses, who had quietly been job hunting, withdrew their applications elsewhere. Little things, then not little at all. Patient satisfaction scores began to rise, though Julia Monroe trusted different indicators more. Near misreporting increased because staff no longer feared being blamed for honesty. Turnover slowed, then dropped. Medication double checks became more consistent when people stopped trying to move invisibly through their own shifts. Doctors and nurses argued openly in ways that were sometimes messy and often healthy because disagreement had finally stopped meaning danger by default. Frank Delaney, after recovering enough to discharge, sent a handwritten card to 4 South in shaky block letters. For the first time since my wife died, I spent time in a hospital where the people looked like they could breathe. Dana pinned the card to the staff bulletin board. Months passed. Victor's name surfaced only in updates from legal local headlines and the occasional grim remark from staff who had once treated hearing about his downfall as too much to hope for. He eventually accepted a plea agreement on reduced charges tied to misdemeanor assault allegations from prior incidents. Civil settlements stripped away most of the wealth he had spent years using as insulation. The medical board suspended his license indefinitely pending further review. In professional circles, his name changed function. It stopped meaning executive success and started meaning institutional failure. Harbor Point changed more slowly and more honestly than gossip ever reported. Julia Monroe became permanent CEO after the board failed to find anyone better. Renee Foster retired. Dana Keller accepted a formal nurse manager role despite swearing for years she never wanted management again. Ethan Park stayed. He said later he had been one bad month from leaving before the incident in room 12, and afterward he wanted to see whether a hospital could actually become something different from the thing that had nearly hollowed it out. Nora remained impossible to categorize for people who like their narrative simple. She still worked bedside. She still floated when staffing collapsed. She still preferred night shift more often than daylight because she liked the honesty of it. But influence gathered around her whether she invited it or not. Staff asked her to mentor preceptors. Julia asked her to review crisis training modules. New nurses sought her out after shift to ask questions they framed as clinical but often were not. How do you know when to push back? What if a doctor gets angry? What if you are right, but you are junior? What if your body is scared before your mind is? Nora never gave speeches in response. She gave instructions. Know your chart. Know your chain of command. Document what happened. Not what you hope someone believes. Protect the patient. Protect yourself. Tell the truth the first time. She was promoted to nurse educator the following year, and then later into broader leadership because, by then, even she could see the pattern. Useful people get pulled toward the places where repair is hardest. She accepted each step reluctantly and did the work anyway. One evening, almost 18 months after Victor left the building in the rain, Nora walked through the emergency department at the end of a shift and paused outside room 12. The room was occupied by a college student with appendicitis and a father trying too hard not to show panic. The lights were lower than they used to be. The hallway felt different. Busy still. Hospitals are always busy. But not braced. Dana came up beside her carrying a chart. You do that sometimes, Dana said. What? Stop here. Nora looked through the glass for a second longer. It reminds me. Dana followed her gaze. Of him. Number. Dana waited. Nora watched the nurse inside room 12 explain the next step in the student's workup, with one hand resting on the bed rail, voice easy, posture open. No fear in the doorway. No one scanning the corridor for danger in a tailored suit. Of the line Nora said at last. Dana frowned slightly. What line? Nora turned toward her. The one between a place where people endure and a place where they can work. Dana looked at the room, then back at Nora. You think one night drew it? No, Nora said. One night made it visible. They stood there while the department breathed around them. Monitors, shoes, distant overhead pages. The ordinary music of a hospital still full of suffering, still imperfect, still human. Then a call light flashed down the hall. Dana lifted the chart. You want me to get that? Nora had already started walking. I'm closer. She moved toward the sound without hurry and without hesitation. Just another nurse crossing polished floor under bright hospital lights carrying no legend except usefulness. and no authority except the kind people trust because it never needs to raise a hand.